Love and Life family. It's your girl, Morgan Renee Myers, tuning in with another reading of For Freedom's by The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer by Chana Kai Lee. We are now on chapter 5, and it is entitled The National Stage. I'm just going to hop right into it. Starts off with two different quotes. The first one says, "If those baboons walk onto the convention floor, we walk out." And this was said by the Texas Governor John Connally to President Lyndon Johnson. Then this is a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer. "But we learned the hard way that even though we had all the law, the white power to us." So I do remember in the last chapter it spoke on just as Fannie rose, higher in civil rights and things like that. And I believe she even went to like the Supreme Court or some uh, higher up court to fight her case about what happened to her in Winona and other cases. And the judge just dismissed it, just didn't even give it a second thought. Just, kind of like today. So this is chapter 5, The National Stage. On April 26, 1964, nearly 300 disfranchised Mississippians arrived in Jackson to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and among them was Fannie. Almost immediately after its founding, Washington, D.C., from which Hamer and other representatives worked and traveled around the nation, speaking at forums and conventions about political and socio-economic conditions in Mississippi. In haunting, vivid detail, they described a decades-old repressive political state that, through legal and extra-legal means, kept black folks from voting. To the shock of their audiences, they oftentimes identified the perpetrators of their exclusion as the same individuals responsible for upholding state and federal law. In many ways, Hamer's role in the MFDP was similar to her role in SNCC, although south into regions where she had never been. In addition, this new national role led to greater exposure for her powerful image, making more than simply a local icon. As a consequence, her sense of her own influence must have grown in direct proportion. Although well known and respected throughout the Mississippi Delta, Hamer did not gain full national prominence until her memorable stand at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. At this convention, the grassroots Freedom Democratic Party of the all-white Mississippi delegation. Fully active in the MFDP since its formation, Hamer was elected vice chairperson of the 68-member delegation that traveled to the convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Peace, peace, everyone. Under the dynamic leadership of their storied woman representative, the Freedom Democrats turned the 1964 Democratic Convention into a political contest that occasioned both defeat and victory for Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi movement. While she won increasing national support for the civil rights cause, the message she carried, Hamer also came away from the convention the idea and justice for all. In going to Atlantic City that summer, Hamer had traveled a long distance in miles and an experience from the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta. Her travels taught her a number of Indeed, the 1964 Democratic Convention was a watershed monument for Hamer. On Friday, August 22, 1964, most of the Freedom Democrats bus, unlike other state delegations, and checked into the rundown, segregated gym motel. According to Counsel Joseph Raw, "You know that's terrible. We couldn't get them decent accommodations. God, it was hot in that motel." The MFDP was trying to make the Democratic Party more inclusive, and due both to finances and the dogged persistence of Jim Crow in the North, the Freedom Democrats had to wait from a segregated base. Hamer, however, had flown to Atlantic City from New York City, where she had made a speech before the parents of Freedom Summer's volunteers a few days before the convention. She joined the MFDP delegates on Saturday morning. As the MFDP got off the bus in Atlantic City, attendance was its own challenge to convention to convention non believers who had all but dismissed the possibility that a meaningful contest could take place. There was nothing else particularly newsworthy about the convention. Everyone predicted that the Democratic Party would nominate Lyndon B. Johnson for president. There was some uncertainty about whether Johnson would nominate Hugh as running mate expected. With such predictability concerning other matters, the MFDP presence attracted media attention. According to one MFDP staffer, Walter Tillow, the TV people instilled a direct line to the hotel, all the TV and radio people. The New York Times, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune covered the challenge story extensively. Unknown to the Freedom Democrats, the Johnson administration also kept a close watch on challenge developments. According to the presidential biographer Robert Dallek, Lyndon Johnson had an obsession with the MFDP that kept him almost hysterical about tracking the party's every move and spoken word. Dallek argues that the White House pressure on the Credentials Committee not to side with MFDP was much more important in shaping conflict. Johnson did not want any embarrassment, especially not from a walkout by white Southern delegates. To keep tabs on the Freedom Democrats, Johnson initiated FBI involvement beginning in mid-July with background search delegates, 30 FBI personnel, 27 agents, 2 stenographers arrived in Atlantic City 2 days before the Freedom Democrats. FBI surveillance included the use of wiretaps and informants who attended all MFDP meetings. With the cooperation of the National Broadcasting Company, the television network covering the convention, some agents posed as journalists to obtain off the record information from Freedom Democrats. That's crazy. Early in the afternoon on the day of their arrival in Atlantic City, Freedom Party delegates held a rally at the Union Baptist Church, their headquarters, for the eventful week. It's RAUH, so I'm going to the Freedom Democrats on the challenge and briefed the press on behind the scenes developments. The Freedom Democrats were serious about the challenge and they organized as if they had every intention of winning, although some were not as optimistic as others. Hamer had her doubts but was hopeful. The challenge was more than a symbolic gesture for most of them. That morning, Freedom Democrats developed various tasks as they prepared for evening meetings with kids. One major task was lobbying different delegations. The MFDP delegates went about this task in a systematic and efficient way. They used information worksheets on which they recorded assessment of each state's delegates and of the credentials committee members. Handwritten comments on the sheets noted the extent of a delegate's support. Strong, definite, sold us out. The party decided that most MFDP staff and volunteers would lobby their own delegates or others specifically assigned to them. Hamer's first assignment was Verna Canson, an influential black member of the California delegation. She was one of 2 California members of the Credentials Committee and one of 7 black members. On the following morning, Saturday, August 22nd, Fannie Lou Hamer and another MFDP leader, Annie Devine, along with MFDP staff volunteer Mindy Samstein, met Verna Canson for breakfast. They needed to know if the MFDP could still count on the California delegation support, which had been promised the week before the convention, as was the support of other states, including Oregon, Michigan, and New York. Through the support of the California Democratic Council, the liberal wing of the California Democratic, the California state delegates had already voted to seat the MFDP upon hearing of its information. Canson was arguably the most prominent black convention delegate from California. Identified her as a key member of the black upper crust and a favorite of Pat Brown, governor of California. Her husband was president of the Sacramento NAACP, and rumors had it he was in line for a federal judgeship. After the breakfast gathering, Devine and Hamer engaged Canson in a passionate discussion about their MFDP cause. They applied significant moral pressure on Canson, and in the end, she came away moved by their appeal. She was left without any doubts about the legal and moral correctness of MFDP's case. She proved her support later that day during the Credentials Committee's hearing when she directed pointed questions at the regular Mississippi delegate and asked whether the delegation chairman was a former Klan member. Canson's questioning did not go over well with some Democrats. Later, during the convention, Senator Hubert Humphrey and the Lyndon Johnson administrative staff put significant pressure on Canson by suggesting that her husband might not be considered for a federal judgeship. Later that week, Governor Pat Brown confirmed indeed that her husband was no longer in consideration. She was torn. On one hand, there was the moral issue of support for disenfranchised Afro Mississippians, and on the other hand, there was her husband's aspirations. Eventually, she ended up withdrawing her support. Dang, that's tough. See how they pit us against each other? Mm. At 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, the MFDP formally presented their cases to the 110 member Credentials Committee. The MFDP maintained the Lily White delegation did not accurately represent the voice of the people of Mississippi. The Freedom Democrats claimed that only it remained true to the principles of the National Democratic Party. The all-white delegation denied black participation, opposed President Lyndon Johnson's domestic agenda, and supported Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. In contrast, the MFDP I did. Who's this man? In contrast, the MFDP supported the incumbent president's policies and was open to all Mississippi residents of voting age. Thus, the MFDP concluded that the all-white delegation was not comprised of true, loyal Democrats. Instead, it was a party of traitors. Most significantly, the MFDP charged that the seating of the traditional delegation was unconstitutional because it excluded blacks. This was in violation of the 14th Amendment. To support its charges, the Freedom Democrats circulated 4,000 to 5,000 briefs to the Credentials Committee and other delegates. By contrast, the regulars presented around 60 briefs in response. Led by E.K. Collins, Mississippi State Senator from Laurel, the regulars claimed that blacks had not been excluded. Moreover, they countered that the regulars deserved to be seated based on their past support of the Democrats. Defending the legitimacy of his delegation, Collins found it necessary to question the motives of the MFDP. He dismissed the Freedom Delegation as being a group of dissatisfied, power-hungry soreheads. The challenger strategies focused on getting 10% of the Credentials Committee delegates, 11 votes, report supporting the challenge. Once the report reached the floor of the convention, the MFDP would push for a roll call vote, thereby preventing individual delegations from hiding behind a vote by he realized possible outcomes to additional delegation could be seated, the MFDP delegation could be or neither. I don't really understand what any of this means. That afternoon, three national civil rights figures, SCLC's Martin Luther King Jr., CORE's James Farmer, and the NAACP's Roy Wilkins, all made statements on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the Credentials Committee. They were preceded by Rita Schwerner, widow of slain Freedom Summer volunteer Michael Schwerner. Representatives of the National Council of Churches also appeared and offered their support. At the end of the hearing, the MFDP counsel, Joseph Raw, made the main feature of the day's testimony was Hamer's of the Winona jail beating. Walter Tillow described her presentation as the clincher. She spoke of her experiences, especially in Winona when she got beat up. Half the committee being women, she had a tremendous impact. A lot of women were crying after she finished. Hamer concluded her remarks by declaring, "If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. The land we have because our lives are being threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America." By the end of her allotted 8 minutes, Hamer had exposed Mississippi for the sadistic brutality so characteristic of its treatments of blacks. Filled with emotion, Hamer wept. "I felt just like I was telling it from the mountain," she told a Jet reporter, Larry Steele. "That's why I like that song, Go Tell It on the Mountain. I feel like I'm talking to the world." Although the network hurriedly cut away from Hamer's testimony to cover a press conference that President Johnson called to lessen the impact of her statement, let me highlight that. It was live on TV and they cut out of what she was saying. Although testimony to cover a press conference that President Johnson had called to lessen the impact of her statement. The MFDP received hundreds of telegrams in support of its efforts. After her testimony, the atmosphere of party members was jubilant, according to Arthur Waskow, another MFDP supporter. In a written account of this, Waskow noted Hamer was agreed to have been its star of the MFDP delegation upbeat in mood. The challengers' case appeared very, very strong to them and to a significant number of delegates from other states. Hamer, however, was a bit peeved with Raw, who who she blamed for Johnson's ruse. But her irritation soon subsided when someone watching the news called out that she had reached a television audience. A television news program aired her full testimony that evening. After the first round of hearings, discussion about what to do next. The consensus seemed to be that the Freedom Party should make additional contact with individual, but the idea proved unfeasible because of time constraints. During the course of conversation that evening, delegates discussed and how to use Martin Luther King Jr., who had recently come to town, in support of the cause. The Freedom Democratic Party delegates decided that King, along with the Credentials Committee member and MFDP supporter Congressman Robert or Bob Kastenmeyer, a Democrat from Wisconsin, should make a joint appeal to black and white Credentials Committee persons in an attempt to secure 11 signatures for a minority report. Sunday, August 23rd, the MFDP delegates caucus proposal introduced by Oregon Congress. After the MFDP rejected an earlier Johnson offer that the MFDP be considered honored guests of the convention, Ed by Moses is from the National Council of Churches. Meyer began the more members of the Credential Committee, and were Edith Green of Oregon, the other leading committee, Charles Diggs, a black congressman from Michigan, and two well-positioned black women delegates, Canson of California and Marjorie King of Washington State. Congresswoman Green introduced the so-called Green Compromise, which proposed that each individual on both Mississippi delegations should be offered the chance to sign a loyalty oath, that any member of either delegation who signed should be seated, all others rejected, and the total number of Mississippi votes split among all those who signed and were seated. Initially, the majority of the Freedom Democrats seemed in favor of this compromise, but Fannie Lou Hamer, in an outburst of anguish, expressed her disgust with the Democratic Party that would even consider seating people who had helped participate in the sterilization of women in Mississippi. This was the second time that Hamer had raised the sterilization issue in a semi-public gathering. In her usual clever way, she seized this particular moment to vent genuine rage as well as to regain the political and moral upper hand in the discussion. Later, as it became increasingly apparent that the MFDP would have to concede something, Hamer agreed to support the Green Compromise. Her initial rejection of the compromise was the unfairness of the entire affair. She was appalled at the thought of accommodating an all-white delegation that had been chosen illegally and at the exclusion of a huge segment of the Mississippi population. Participants agreed that the Green Resolution was worthy of consideration, even though the Freedom Party's full demands were still on the table. When she was not in group meetings, Fannie Lou Hamer spent much of that Sunday lobbying and making sure that everyone understood, as did Moses Devine and a few other COFO and MFDP staffers. One of the crucial meetings that took place that Sunday, one occurred at Martin Luther King Jr.'s suite, where individuals gradually arrived for brunch. On time, but after waiting a moment, decided to leave. He authorized Edith Green to speak on his behalf. Other members of the Credentials Committee appeared later. Ed King, Roy Wilkins, and James Farmer were there, as were some individuals. Hamer, Moses, and Ella Baker, however, were still at their headquarters at Union Baptist Church, where the Freedom Democrats had met earlier that Sunday morning in preparation for a rally. As he waited for the meeting, Arthur Waskow had an interesting conversation with Wilkins about the history of the NAACP and the need to have its records microfilmed and distributed to university libraries and historians. Wilkins remarked that this was a good idea since the NAACP had not gotten enough credit for the way they carried the civil rights for the past 50 years, and making this material available to historians would make it much more likely understanding of the NAACP's role. This conversation foreshadowed the conflict that Wilkins would have later with Hamer and other Freedom Democrats around what he perceived to be their lack of respect for the NAACP. King Suite, and informal discussion began. The reason for the gathering was to determine what the Freedom Party was willing to give up and what it was willing to accept. Some of the time was spent deciding on individuals to target for lobbying. By this time, Edith Green had reintroduced her compromise proposal and reported that the Freedom Party had considerably more than the 11 signatures for a roll call vote. However, when pressed by Raw and Diggs to name these supporters, she declined, perhaps to protect her backers from being lobbied by those favorable to the Johnson Compromise. Clear to the members of the Johnson camp were getting their official offer on the table was still that of fraternal seats for the Freedom Party, plus perhaps a few items like the right to read from the platform before the convention. At a moment of seeming impasse between the Johnson and MFDP supporters, tempers flared. At one point in the discussion on this offer, Diggs indicated that it seemed like, to which Edith Green snapped, "If it were a matter of women's rights, I could never conceive of accepting such a meaningless gesture." Finally, word reached Bob Moses at the rally to send some Freedom Democrats to the meeting in King's Suite so that Moses replied that he could not go because he still had not yet spoken at the rally. However, Hamer, Baker, and Henry, along with other activists, Hartman Turnbow, Victoria Gray, and Annie Devine. They all then directed other members of the party not to go into individual meetings with the Credentials Committee delegates in order not to frighten them politically. Although King's Suite was filled to capacity, the MFDP leadership insisted that the other delegates join in by standing outside and listening from the hallway through an open door. Hamer and others of their delegates had a right to participate in crucial decisions. For Hamer, mass or collective participation meant simply that everyone would join in the important decision-making process, no matter how large the group. Feasibility and protocol took a back seat to pure democratic procedure in his mind and practice. Hamer and the MFDP had come too far and had been excluded too long to yield at a particular moment to the custom of representative leadership and decision making. After the MFDP delegates arrived, discussion resumed, but no major decision was reached before adjournment. That Sunday night, the MFDP delegates returned to Union Baptist Church, where they met with their supporters. Afterward, Hamer and others went to the boardwalk outside, and Core held a vigil throughout the 4-day affair. While there, Hamer assumed her usual role of keeping everyone's spirits up. On Monday, the convention opened with both Mississippi delegations seated in the gallery, a temporary solution. The day before, Credentials Committee Chair David Lawrence had postponed making a report to the convention until Tuesday evening. Also, around mid-morning that Monday, another meeting was held among MFDP leaders and their supporters, Credentials, and some national civil rights figures. It took place at the Johnson Command Post at the Pageant Motel next door to the convention hall. Many of those attending had participated in the Sunday meeting. Aaron Henry, Ed King, and Kastenmeyer. The only newcomer was Senator Hubert Humphrey, who had called the MFDP delegation needed any further. Supporters were taking their challenge seriously and becoming alarmed. Humphrey's presence provided that they would accept no less than the Green proposal, which was already somewhat of a retreat on the part, since the Green offer was itself a compromise, one that was far less radical than the MFDP's original demand to be seated unconditionally. During the meeting, Moses reminded others that only Negroes could speak for Negroes in Mississippi, to could speak for Russians, French for Frenchmen. He turned to King and added, "Now you can throw your book away." After all, Baker responded by adding, according to the interview, "I don't care about people getting $20,000 a year judgeships," referring to Verna Canson, "and I don't care about some professor losing his. I don't care about traders like Humphrey deserting their liberal trends." As her colleagues Baker and Moses castigated those in favor of additional compromise, charging them with indulging in political self-interest, Hamer again took the moral high road, this time by invoking religion and God. She singled out and equivocating Humphrey, whom she later described as sitting there with big crocodile tears in his eyes. "Senator Humphrey, I've been praying about you and I've been thinking about you, and you're a good man and you know what's right. The trouble is you're afraid to do what you know is right. You just want a lot of people has lost their. I will take care of you even if you lose this job. But Humphrey, if you take this job, you won't be worth anything." Mr. Humphrey, just as Humphrey had started crying, so did Hamer. Baker and Hamer were not the only anger and disgust by Humphrey's condescension. Earlier, Green had stormed out of the meeting when Humphrey remarked, "Well, I don't see what they're doing." I described the meeting at the Pageant Motel as occasion. Moses came down from it looking like Moses came down from it looking like death itself. The minority proved far stronger and far more tough-minded than the administration or the liberal establishment had expected. Strength had forced another. Significantly, this meeting confrontation